Hey guys, tonight we will step into the dark corridors of Hampton Court, where Henry VIII's sexual secrets not only fractured 6 marriages, but also toppled the spiritual throne of the Roman Church. From turning the bedchamber into a death sentence courtroom for a queen to the break with Rome, undertaken merely to pursue a teenage girl, this story will reveal the darkest side of a power-hungry, sex-obsessed king. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the cold corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where darkness seems ready to swallow every footstep, the embroidered drapes hide not only the gloomy stonework, but also a young king's frenzied sexual cravings. In the spring of 1509, Henry Tudor was crowned a golden prince, standing 6 feet tall, approximately 1 meter 83, his body as solid as a warhorse, and astonishingly agile whenever he vaulted the stakes on the jousting field. Morning sunlight would glint off his crown, casting a radiant halo around him. Yet a single glance could strip away that splendor and expose the hidden lust beneath. Henry appeared as the perfect emblem of the Renaissance, holding a globe in one hand, wearing a crown upon his head. He strode forward slowly yet proudly. In the eyes of his courtiers, he symbolized ultimate power and strength, yet the king himself believed that it was his fierce sexual potency that truly proved the divine right bestowed upon him. He regarded his virility as a sacred gift from God, convinced that only by demonstrating mastery in the bedchamber could he legitimately claim the throne. At that time, English nobility still upheld fidelity and chastity as immutable virtues. Marriage was viewed as a holy covenant, and adultery, a sin capable of shattering a family's honor under Tudor rule. However, those standards quickly faded. The royal court became a perilous maze, where a single misplaced whisper or a seductive glance could determine anyone's fate. When night fell, flickering candlelight on the walls cast vague shadows that seemed to whisper secrets. In that atmosphere, Henry did not hesitate to display his promiscuous nature. He turned the bedchamber into an instrument of power, where sex was no longer a song of love, but a weapon of domination, intimidation, and manipulation. Every step he took stirred a chill breeze, as though heralding the tragedies yet to unfold. Entering an oak-panelled chamber, one could sense the rapid heartbeat echoing within. Mingling with the scent of burning wax and withered lavender petals, the faint glow reflecting off crystal lanterns painted the image of a man torn between polished nobility and untamed desire. Henry would sit for hours by a window, gazing at the star-filled sky, as if seeking answers to his insatiable cravings. His sighs echoed through the night audible, yet impossible to tell whether they were anguished confessions or silent prayers. Queen Catherine of Aragon, a patient wife who had upheld the court's dignity for 24 years, was forced to endure public humiliation when Henry paraded young mistresses before her, flaunting lavish gifts in her presence. Catherine's strained smile seemed ready to shatter under the weight of disgrace. What had once been core values, fidelity and chastity, became fragile and more prone to breaking than the purest of mirrors. The royal household was always filled with the sound of heavy footsteps and the rustle of embroidered gowns. Whispers among courtiers trembled with speculation about which gentlewoman the young king would summon next. Those girls could not refuse Henry's command. Declining meant exile from court, loss of future prospects, or even graver consequences. To him, they were mere pawns on the chessboard of power, employed either to sire heirs or to satisfy momentary lust. Each night played out like a new drama, candle flames flickering, wind whispering through the leaves, and prayers murmured in the dark. Henry would approach each door, tap softly as if testing, then slip inside quietly to transform the encounter into a feast of dominance. Once he was sated, the mistress would be swiftly removed from the dazzling setting, reduced to a fading memory among the courtiers. It all began with the contradictory fusion of two aspects: a refined, glamorous exterior and a bottomless hunger within. That very contradiction laid the foundation for the tragedies to come: shocking divorces, merciless executions, and the historic break with Rome. Future chronicles would remember Henry VIII not only as a powerful king, but also as an icon of unrestrained desire and ruthless authority. Now, let yourself relax. Breathe slowly, and imagine the flickering candlelight in that royal chamber. Allow your mind to drift across each creaking floorboard, to hear the rustle of a silken gown and the sigh of a king wrestling with power and desire. Almost as soon as he realized that Queen Catherine's position could not fulfill his expectation of a son, Henry began hunting for new lovers within the royal court. Unlike the elegant Francis I of France, Henry wielded his power like a sledgehammer. He publicly humiliated the Queen by parading his mistresses, flaunting gold-plated jewellery before her eyes, forcing Catherine to conceal her shame to preserve the last fragments of her dignity. The young girls, sometimes barely into their teenage years, would leave the king's private chambers, carrying lavish gifts with no explanation, leaving Catherine to endure unspoken, searing pain. Among his first mistresses was Elizabeth Bessie Blount, who bore him an illegitimate son in the year 1519. The supreme joy of finally witnessing male seed spurred Henry to contemplate legitimizing the child, bestowing upon him the bright cloak of ducal knighthood. Yet in the end it served only as a dagger to Catherine's pride. Henry so cunningly displayed that every failure to produce a lawful heir lay at her feet, not with the sacred seed he bestowed. In the eyes of the courtiers, none dared to voice reproach, for the king's power extended through every corridor of the palace. Next came the Boleyn sisters, Mary and Anne. Mary consented to become a public instrument of the king's desires, enduring humiliation only to be married off to a minor noble and swiftly exiled from court when she was no longer of use. The image of Mary Boleyn departing in a silk gown still faintly scented with noble perfume revealed the cruel mercy of the king when needed. She was bought off with gifts and promises of calm waters. When no longer needed, she was cast aside like an old cloak. This pattern repeated with horrifying precision: ardent pursuit, bribery with gold and silver, violent possession, and a cold-blooded discard. Those women were nothing more than pawns on Henry's power chessboard, moved at his whim to serve a single purpose: the production of a royal heir. They bore no names, only first mistress, second mistress, and were soon forgotten in the annals of court memory. By flickering candlelight, their silhouettes would drift past windows, leaving behind sighs that echoed through oak-panelled rooms. Those sighs reverberated down the corridors, reminding courtiers that here, sex was not a song of love, but a tool of ambition and oppression. An oppressive atmosphere continued to envelop the royal residence. Velvet drapes trembled in phantom breezes, redolent with the scent of burning incense and wilted lavender. Henry, calm and unhurried, surveyed his harem as a general inspects his battlefield, deploying each encounter as a calculated move in a game of fate. Catherine, in her silent oratory, bore witness to these reunions with a forced smile and eyes reflecting unending sorrow. Then Anne Boleyn appeared, bringing a new wind that unsettled Henry to his core. However, that story will unfold in the next part, as his demands grow ever more ruthless and the game of courtly love descends into an inescapable tragedy. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's life like a new challenge. Unlike her sister Mary, Anne maintained her distance with a careful grace, wielding her intellect and wit as weapons. In dimly lit halls and candlelit corners, she would allow just a fleeting glimpse of her smile or a subtle arch of her brow, each moment sparking in the king's heart a hunger that soon became obsessive. Over the course of 7 long years, the most powerful monarch in England appeared more like a lovesick youth than a sovereign ruler, pouring out a flood of love letters so explicit that they threatened the era's sense of decorum. Among those letters were phrases praising thy little breasts, sweet as fledgling birds, a declaration so raw. It left courtiers whispering in shock. That torrid longing proved to be the tinder for a conflict of unprecedented scale. The king's desire for Anne ignited a fierce separation from Rome, sending ripples through Christendom itself. For a full 6 years, the realm watched as Henry's marriage to Catherine underwent trial after trial, each session intensifying his impatience and paranoia. He began to see opposition in every glance. Convinced that anyone who stood between him and Anne was an enemy of divine will, and by extension, an enemy of him, every rebuke from Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, every delay from papal envoys in Rome, fed the furnace of his fury. In the year 1533, when Anne finally carried his child, Henry made his momentous declaration. His marriage to Catherine was no longer valid, and he proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Church of England, with a voice that echoed through St. Crost, Paul's Cathedral and beyond. He banished papal authority from English shores and legitimized his union with Anne. It was a triumph of personal will over centuries of ecclesiastical tradition, a seismic shift that transformed a private love affair into a matter of state and faith. Under the soft glow of chapel candles, English bishops and peers knelt to witness the king's act, their faces illuminated with equal parts awe and fear. From that moment on, the question of whom Henry could bed or wed became inseparable from the question of who had spiritual authority in the land. The sanctity of marriage, once guarded by Rome's long arm, now lay at the mercy of the Tudor court. Every public sermon, every heraldic banner, every parish register was rewritten to reflect the king's decision. Yet even as Anne's womb swelled, Henry's mood grew more mercurial. One night he would pace the tapestried corridors, reciting his own arguments for divorce as though they were lines of sacred scripture. The next, he would erupt in rage at the slightest suggestion that his action had set a dangerous precedent. He believed himself chosen by God not only to rule England, but to redefine the very framework of Christian marriage. In sermons delivered under hushed voices, preachers spoke of the new English church as a beacon of royal freedom. But behind closed doors, many clergy wondered whether the true motive was lust rather than doctrine. Meanwhile, Anne navigated this storm with extraordinary skill. She understood that her power lay not only in her status as queen, but in the very nature of her resistance. She remained reserved in public, offering gentle smiles and courteous nods. Even as the king showered her with titles and estates, her influence at court became undeniable. Nobles sought her favour, foreign ambassadors bribed her attendance, and pamphlets circulated, praising her learning and grace. Yet Anne never allowed herself to appear too secure. She knew that the same lofty heights she occupied could just as swiftly become a lonely perch. Throughout those years, the corridors of Hampton Court echoed with the rustle of silk and the click of velvet slippers. Knights and ladies in waiting whispered of Anne's next move, of the subtle shift in her posture that signalled displeasure, or the brief flicker of hope in her dark eyes. Henry, in turn, became a fixture by her side, a king consumed by longing. Even as he ruled with an iron fist, his advisers tiptoed around him, offering counsel only when he demanded it. For they knew that any contradicting word might be recorded as opposition to the sacred fruits of his union with Anne. When the anticipated birth finally occurred, a daughter, later to be named Elizabeth, the court held its breath. For months, Henry believed that this child would be the promised son, the heir who would carry on his name. Yet when the Queen presented a baby girl, the king's joy turned to cold disappointment. Still, he proclaimed himself victorious. The separation from Rome was complete, and his daughter's future would belong to an England ruled by its own sovereign church. The new church's bells rang across the countryside, calling the faithful to pray for their king and queen. Houses were decked in black banners with the royal arms, and everywhere, sermons celebrated the glory of a monarchy unbound by foreign decree. But in the hush of private chambers and the shadowed corners of convents, many nuns and priests wept for what had been lost, the unity of Christ's body, the centuries-old bond between England and Rome, and the dignity of marriage upheld by an institution larger than any one ruler. And so, as Anne Boleyn held her infant daughter close, the court stood on the brink of a new era, one born of passionate love letters and ecclesiastical upheaval. Henry's act of defiance reshaped the spiritual map of Europe, but at a cost measured not only in politics and power, but in the fragile hopes of those who believed marriage to be more than a tool of ambition. In the stillness of the night, one could almost hear the soft patter of a cradle, the distant toll of newly cast bells, and the sigh of a kingdom caught between devotion and desire. Thus ends the chapter of Anne's long courtship and the birth of a new church, her story continuing in the next part, where the dawn of religious revolution meets the turbulence of a king's unquenchable appetite. The royal game resumed with a cruel twist when Anne's child proved to be a daughter named Elizabeth, rather than the son Henry so desperately desired. The initial warmth of their marriage cooled rapidly, and within mere months of their union, the king's attention drifted elsewhere. He turned first to Jane Seymour, once Anne's own lady-in-waiting, whose gentle manner and soft brown hair offered him a fleeting reprieve from disappointment. Jane bore him a son, Edward VI, but her triumph turned tragic when she succumbed to complications just 12 days after childbirth. Her brief life and death set the stage for a succession of ill-fated matches in the years to come. Next came Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait had delighted Henry's eye. Yet, when she arrived in England, the mirror of reality shattered that expectation. Henry pronounced her so unattractively plain that he claimed an inability to consummate the marriage. Courtiers and physicians were summoned to debate the king's supposed lack of desire, turning what should have been a private matter into a public spectacle. Their marriage was annulled swiftly under the pretext of non-consummation, leaving Anne of Cleves to live out her days as the king's beloved sister, spared execution but robbed of any true royal status. Henry's next conquest was Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, and no more than 15 years of age. In the pale candlelight of Hampton Court's bedchambers, the corpulent king, his once athletic frame now burdened by obesity and a chronic leg wound, set his sights on a child. Catherine, terrified yet bound by the etiquette of court, became a plaything for the aging monarch. He showered her with jewels, called her "my rose without a thorn," and presided over her every movement. Yet Catherine's own youthful indiscretions, regarded today as clear evidence of child exploitation, were construed as capital crimes. When evidence of her past inappropriate relations emerged, Henry sentenced her to death in a move as ruthless as it was hypocritical. In the summer of 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the block, her body trembling, not with the finality of justice, but with the terror of a child condemned by a man she scarcely understood. Only after Catherine Howard's execution did Henry find a moment of uneasy solace in the marriage that followed. Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed survivor of court intrigue, approached her role with cautious intelligence. She tended to the king's wounds and fears rather than inflame his passions, offering companionship more than carnal delight. Her calm demeanour and devotion sustained Henry through his final years, marked by physical infirmity and the spectre of mortality. As he lay reduced by illness, he found comfort in her ministrations instead of in the pleasures of youth. Through these successive unions, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr, the image of England's sovereign shifted from Renaissance prince to a figure beset by desire, disappointment, and desperation. Each marriage, once entered amid grand ceremony and hopeful promises, dissolved into bitterness, scandal, or tragedy. In the hush of candlelit corridors, the echoes of Henry's footsteps carried the weight of every broken vow and every shattered life. His court, once a glittering hub of pageantry, became a hall of whispered rumours and hanging sorrows. as each queen's fate served as a grim reminder that, under his rule, love was never safe, and power could be as lethal as any sword, and so the Tudor chessboard continued to shift, each move guided by Henry's relentless pursuit of heirs and his restless appetite for control, though Catherine Parr's gentle presence would lull him toward the end of his days. The pattern of passion and ruin, so vividly set into motion by Henry's earlier matches, would leave its mark on the crown and the kingdom for generations to come. The machinery of English power and law was reshaped entirely to serve Henry's personal appetites. He harnessed his new title as Supreme Head of the Church of England to crown himself sovereign in all matters of love, decreeing that adultery was a mortal sin for his subjects, but a sanctified act for the king. Any cleric who dared to withhold the blessing of his marriage was branded a heretic and burned at the stake, their screams echoing through cathedral walls as a gruesome testament to royal will. Under Henry's direction, the law of treason was broadened to encompass adultery with the king. Any liaison not sanctioned by his royal desire risked a death sentence. Bishops and judges, once arbiters of conscience, became pawns, reciting proclamations that conflated divine ordinance with the monarch's whims. Each newly issued statute echoed through the corridors of Westminster, binding church, parliament, courts, and the smallest manor house to the capricious moral code of a single ruler, inheritance laws. 2. Were rewritten as easily as one might revise a grocery list. A child born to a lawful queen might claim the throne, while a royal bastard, if it suited Henry, could be legitimized with a stroke of a pen. Conversely, legitimate offspring could be rendered illegitimate if their mother fell out of royal favor. In scattered manors across the realm, families whispered anxiously, for any shift in the king's marital status could erase heirships and fortunes. In an instant, soldiers and stewards alike paced in sleepless worry. Would today's child of honor be tomorrow's outcast within the great halls of power? Members of Parliament became an echo chamber, reciting motions carefully crafted to reaffirm the king's supremacy. Peers would rise to their feet and applaud declarations that, only a year before, would have seemed sacrilegious. The House of Lords, once a bastion of noble independence, now moved to the beat of Henry's command. Even the ancient writs that safeguarded the rights of free men were amended, sharpened into instruments that could split families apart to satisfy a royal decree. Beyond the golden dais, the common people felt the shift in unsettling ways. Village constables, brandishing warrants sealed with the royal crest, patrolled lanes in search of whispers of scandal. A peasant could be accused of treason for repeating a rumor about the king's bedchamber, and a local priest might vanish in chains for refusing to baptize the child of a known mistress. Tax collectors, emboldened by the law, seized livestock and grain as royal tithes to fund lavish court festivities, celebrating each new marriage or annulment, from the Cotswolds to the Fens. A hush fell over fields and cottages, as neighbours looked over shoulders in dread that any conversation might lead to ruin. Within this climate of fear and fascination, noble families began to view their daughters as sacrificial tokens in a broader game of influence. Daughters were instructed in the art of courtesy and flattery from earliest childhood, groomed to catch the king's eye, and thus elevate the family's standing. Parents whispered prayers in candlelit chambers, willing their children into the royal orbit, yet trembling at the thought of their potential fates. For some, a single royal glance promised unimaginable wealth and titles. For others, it meant the end of innocence, a swift fall from grace. Or worse, meanwhile, those who dared to refuse the looming promise or the subtle pressure to advance their daughters faced a harsher humiliation. Houses once proud of their lineage found themselves labelled enemies of the crown, their coats of arms struck from heraldic rolls, estates confiscated, and members hauled to London for public shaming. Public executions, once reserved for common criminals, now featured banners proclaiming treasonous disloyalty for those who spurned royal favour. The noose and the scaffold were as much tools of social control as swords or edicts. Deep within the royal court, courtiers scrambled to align themselves with the prevailing winds of Henry's desires. A whispered compliment to a temporary favourite could elevate a household. A misjudged slight might doom an entire lineage. Young lords learned early that discretion was perilous. Speak too often of a particular queen, and one might suffer the king's wrath. Utter a word of dissent, and one might vanish with no explanation. The very concept of loyalty became slippery, defined only by those who could obey without question, and vanish without a trace. In the shadow of St. Paul's and the Tower, a silent dread took hold, that love itself had become a weapon. Where courtly love had once inspired poetry and lute songs, it was now a means to an end. An entry in the ledger of royal intrigue. Songs lamenting lost loves were scrawled by trembling hands and hidden beneath floorboards. Secret romances, veiled in candlelight, ended at dawn when king's men made their rounds, collecting intelligence like tolls on a highway. Thus did England's social fabric stretch and tear under the weight of a single man's desires. The values once thought immutable marital fidelity, the sanctity of vows, were recast as relics of a bygone age, swept away by Henry's sweeping religious reforms. And as the kingdom drifted deeper into this new order, the faint hum of church bells could be heard, tolling not for peace or penance, but for the ever-shifting will of a king who had mastered both the sword and the bedchamber. In the quiet hours before dawn, one might still hear a distant lament, an echo of voices lost to the age of Tudor ambition, reminding us that when law and love become a monarch's playthings, a realm itself slips into restless slumber. Waiting for the next twist of the royal hand, the Tudor palace harboured more than queens and stately dowagers. It sheltered a host of unnamed ladies' chambermaids, gentlewomen of minor nobility, and foreign guests alike, all drawn unwillingly into Henry's circle of affection. None could refuse the king's summons. A simple nod from his adviser or a whispered command at dawn was enough to seal their fate. Those whom fortune favoured received a tidy pension and were quietly escorted out of court, never to be heard from again. The less fortunate, particularly those who found themselves with child-faced charges of royal treason or carnal transgression and bore the full weight of brutal punishment, by elevating himself to supreme head of the Church of England, Henry effectively sanctified adultery with his person as a divine right while branding any dissent as heresy. Ripe for burial by fire, a priest who refused to perform the king's wedding ceremony or acknowledge his divorce would find himself condemned before dawn, his life snuffed out in the name of religious orthodoxy. The law, once a stable pillar, was twisted into a tool of terror. Treason now encompassed the simplest refusal to gratify the monarch's desires, and marriages were contracted or annulled at the whim of royal fancy or diplomatic necessity. Inheritance statutes were rewritten as casually as journal entries. Legitimate heirs could be disinherited with a line through their names, while bastards might be elevated to princes with the stroke of a quill. Widows who spoke too loudly of their grievances risked losing their dower lands. Children born of those sacred liaisons might disappear into obscurity or be thrust into positions of power depending on their usefulness to the crown. Throughout the palace, corridors echoed with the rustle of parchment as clerks recorded new decrees, each one redefining loyalty, marriage, and bloodline. In this climate of fear and spectacle, the sanctity of sexuality, a private bond between two souls, became a weapon of statecraft. Queenly love, once an emblem of stability, was reduced to a stage upon which Henry performed his most ruthless ambitions. Behind every velvet curtain and beneath every fur-trimmed cloak lingered the spectre of exploitation. Even the courtyard fountains, once symbols of purity, now seemed to murmur secrets of midnight assignations and unspoken pacts. The anonymous ladies of the court, those who rose before dawn to light the candles and set the tables, knew better than anyone the price of refusal. A reluctant smile, a slight tremor in the hand as they poured wine, might seal their destinies. Some found themselves summoned to the king's private chambers, with promises of reward. Others were taken in the hush of night and left at dawn with only a handful of coins and a lifetime of shame. Those who dared to speak out encountered swift, merciless retribution, a harsh verdict, the roar of a judge, and then the crackle of flames in a public square. Diplomats and ambassadors watched in horror as the king's personal life became a matter of state. Delegations that once negotiated treaties over fine wine were now required to witness annulments as proof of England's ecclesiastical independence. Foreign visitors learned that entering Henry's court meant accepting its bloody rules. A compliment to the Queen might win favour, but a misplaced glance at a chambermaid could lead to scandal. Ministers of state, once masters of protocol, now tiptoed around a monarch whose desires dictated policy and turned private passion into a matter of public record. Throughout the royal households, children of gentle birth were quietly warned of the dangers that lurked behind silken drapes. Fathers coached daughters in the arts of courtesy and concealment, teaching them to master polite speech and controlled glances. Mothers prayed that their children would pass unnoticed by royal guards, and yet every generation seemed to offer fresh sacrifices to the altar of Henry's hunger. Court entertainments, masks of devotion, and pageants of chivalry grew increasingly macabre, hinting at the bloody reality behind the gilded masks. Even the lecture halls of Cambridge and Oxford felt the ripple of Henry's decrees. Professors of theology found their lectures altered by royal mandate. Sermons bent to extol the sanctity of the king's bedchamber. Pilgrims who journeyed to cathedrals now knelt under banners, proclaiming the monarch's supremacy over spiritual matters. Novels and ballads that once celebrated courtly love were quietly suppressed, while propaganda tracts praising the divine nature of Henry's passions circulated in city squares. Deep within the palace vaults, documents lay in neat stacks, each bearing the signet of a different queen or mistress. The registry of marriages and annulments read like a ledger of conquests, each entry a testament to the way love had been transformed into a ledger of gains and losses. And outside those vaults, in the silent wing where the king's unrecorded relationships dwelt, the walls bore faint stains of tears and incense, relics of devotion forced into hiding. So complete was the transformation that, by candlelight, one might almost believe the Tudor court to be a distant realm, where personal desire was law and law was desire. The archbishops and magistrates stood as mere shadows behind the throne, as powerless as any courtier to resist the tides of Henry's urges. And as the kingdom slumbered beneath the weight of these reforms, the echoes of 1,000 restless nights whispered through every chamber, reminding all who listened that when sex becomes a sovereign's right, even the sturdiest walls cannot keep out the chill of fear. On the international stage, Henry's marital upheavals sent ripples of unease through every court in Europe. His decision to sever ties with Rome in 1533 shattered centuries-old bonds with the Papal States, leaving England and Ireland adrift in a sea of Catholic kingdoms. Cardinal legates once welcomed as honoured guests were now unwelcome strangers. Ambassadors from Rome no longer received the courtesy of an audience. In their stead, King Henry's envoys strode confidently through empty halls where once Pope's banners had flown. Traditional diplomatic alliances, long woven together through royal marriages, began to unravel like frayed threads. The infamous feud between the Tudors and the Habsburgs, once tempered by shared interests, bristled anew with each public denunciation of papal authority. The Spanish court, bound by history and blood to Catherine of Aragon, recoiled at England's schism and tightened its blockade of trade and goodwill. Meanwhile, the newly emerging Protestant princes in the German duchies regarded Henry's break with admiration tinged with suspicion. They saw in his bold defiance a mirror of their own religious stirrings, yet they wondered if a king motivated by personal passion could be trusted as a spiritual ally. Even the proud French monarchy, heir to Capetian dignity and wary of Habsburg power, approached marriage talks with England in cautious whispers. Louis XV's ministers, mindful of Henry's capricious past, insisted on portrait sittings and cautious parleys. They remembered Anne of Cleves, whose painted likeness had enthralled Henry's gaze, only to betray him upon arrival. An incident that became whispered scandal and diplomatic embarrassment. No princess from Paris dared to envision herself crossing the Channel without first pondering whether her beauty would withstand the scrutiny of a fickle sovereign. To accommodate these shifting needs, English law became the tailor's pattern, cut and sewn to order for each diplomatic stitch. The treason statutes were amended urgently whenever an ambassador's speech hinted at papal sympathy. Inheritance laws were rewritten overnight if an overseas envoy hinted at a bride worth negotiating for. Church rites were recast to formalize alliances one day and annul them the next. Each service presided over by bishops whose robes quivered at the prospect of defying a royal decree. In this whirlwind of legal drafts and proclamations, the old sense of stable precedent gave way to a cruel dance of ink and parchment. Historians of later generations would point to Henry's reign as the cautionary tale of legal fragility in the face of concentrated will. They wrote of Tudor jurisprudence, a term that echoed through lecture halls and law libraries as a shorthand for how easily statutes could bend to one man's desires. Even after Henry's death, his legislative footprints remained deep. Laws governing royal marriage persisted into the Stuart era, constraining Charles I and fueling controversies that would ignite civil war. When questions arose over the proper role of Parliament versus the monarch, jurists cited the precedents set by Henry VIII as examples both of ambition's reach and of its perilous legacy. In the Royal Archives at Westminster, one might still find chipped seals and yellowed proclamations bearing Henry's hand. Each document embodied the tension between crown and church, marriage and state, law and desire by candlelight. Clerks copying these texts may have paused, quill suspended, as if feeling the weight of a kingdom's upheaval pressed against their parchment. And beyond the palace gates, townsfolk whispered of foreign armies wary of England's sudden estrangement. Merchants lamented forbidden trade routes, and mothers warned daughters that no alliance built on unstable vows could endure. Thus did Henry VIII's personal crusade ripple outward, reshaping not only the map of faith but the very foundations of power. What began as a king's quest for an heir became a saga of fractured alliances and rewritten laws, a testament to how a single ruler's desires could reorganize the course of nations. In the hush before dawn, one might almost hear the rustle of centuries-old paper and the echo of distant bells, reminding the world that when marriage becomes politics and politics become law, the boundaries between love, faith, and authority blur into uneasy twilight. Under Henry's long shadow, Tudor culture and the arts took on a new, darker hue. Portraits of fallen queens were confiscated or shredded, their silk gowns and jewelled collars erased from memory. Paintings that once celebrated pure, courtly love images of gentle lords serenading ladies under moonlight were supplanted by propaganda, extolling royal supremacy, sermonizing on the divine right of a monarch to shape both church and state. The sonnets and ballads that had once given voice to tender affections faded from favour, replaced by hymns declaring loyalty to the king's desires and paeans to his unassailable authority. In candlelit chambers, lute lay silent, their strings unplayed, as noble patrons turned their commissions toward grand tapestries, illustrating triumphs over papal tyranny or scenes of Henry dispensing justice from a gilded throne. As the 16th century waned, the very idea of romantic love seemed suspect in the wake of such political spectacle. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, and later Queen herself, maintained a carefully preserved image of chastity, a living refutation of her father's violent betrayals. She cloaked herself in the symbolism of the Virgin Queen, draping her court in white and silver, wielding her unmarried status as both shield and scepter. In doing so, she reclaimed the poetic notion of love as something sacred and untainted, using her persona to counteract the Tudor precedent of marriage as mere policy. Poets and courtiers who once dared to wax lyrical about earthly passion now hid their verses in private collections, fearful of royal disfavour, or worse. The Stuart era inherited these wounds, approaching dynastic marriages with a wary heart. James I. Though distant in temperament, I felt the echoes of his grandfather's excesses as he negotiated alliances for his own children. French and Danish princesses came to court with carefully vetted reputations, and bridal portraits were scrutinized not just for beauty, but for evidence of virtue. Every diplomatic envoy carried reports on hygiene, lineage, and family rumor. For no monarch wished to repeat the scandal of a bride deemed unpleasant to the eyes, or a queen accused of indiscretion. The tragic tales of Catherine Howard and Anne of Cleves were taught as cautionary legends in the corridors of power. Their names whispered whenever a father considered sending his daughter to Windsor or Whitehall. By the 19th century, the stone walls of Hampton Court Palace and the Tower of London stood as silent witnesses to the tragedies of Tudor romance. Visitors would shiver at tales of Catherine Howard's screams echoing through the ancient kitchens, or glimpse the spectral outline of Anne Boleyn drifting through the chapel where she had once knelt. Tour guides, with lanterns in hand, regaled guests with stories of secret lovers hidden behind tapestry panels, of clandestine marriages performed by rogue clergymen, and of the blood-stained scaffolds erected in the courtyard's shadow. Each retelling was a reminder that behind the polished facades and intricate wood carvings lay a history soaked in betrayal and heartbreak. Artists and writers of the Victorian era found endless inspiration in this haunted legacy. Novels portrayed Tudor courtships as fatal attractions, weaving narratives of doomed love affairs and royal caprice. Painters captured the pale terror in a fallen queen's overgrown eyes, or the haughty defiance of a princess who would not bend. The Gothic revival, with its obsession for the medieval and macabre, drew deeply from Tudor lore, adorning stately homes with pointed arches, stained glass scenes of beheaded consorts, and gargoyles that seemed to leer at passers-by with vengeful amusement. In drawing rooms heated by crackling hearths, families passed around volumes of poetry, lamenting the vanished glories of courtly romance. Each verse tinged with melancholy for an age when love had known no fear, an age now irrevocably lost to Henry's insatiable desires. Even today, as tourists wander through the oak-panelled Great Hall or stand beneath the flush of Tudor brickwork, the air seems thick with echoes of the past. The carved hammer-beam roof, once dripping with royal banners, now bears silent witness to decades of whispered scandals. Tourists lean in close to touch the cold stone where Catherine Parr might have knelt, imagining the prayers she offered for peace in a palace that had known only turmoil. In the Queen's Guard room, battered pikes stand guard over dusty armour, symbols not just of military might, but of a court where every gesture, even that of a reluctant mistress, rippled through the fabric of society. In the hush between the clack of camera shutters, one can almost hear the soft lilt of a forgotten ballad, its lyrics praising a love that dared to defy protocol. The ghosts of Tudor poets seem to sigh in the rafters, lamenting the day when art became a tool of propaganda and love a currency tossed aside for alliances and heirs. And as the afternoon light fades into twilight, the palace seems to exhale, releasing centuries of longing, regret, and the faint hope that someday, beneath these venerable roofs, love might again be remembered not as a bargaining chip, but as a sacred bond. Thus did the arts and culture of Tudor England bend and bow under the weight of Henry's passions, leaving behind a tapestry woven of ambition and eroticism. Yet in the echoes of Elizabeth's restrained court, the Stuarts' cautious alliances, and the Victorian revival of Gothic romance, the spirit of genuine love endured, hidden, perhaps, but never wholly extinguished by the king whose desires once reshaped an empire. The tumultuous ebb and flow of the Tudor dynasty left indelible marks upon both architecture and economy. Grand chambers and private apartments were hastily refitted whenever Henry elevated a new wife to queenly status. Carved stone reliefs and painted shields, bearing the emblems of a former queen, were chiselled away at dawn's first light, replaced overnight with new insignia, commemorating the sovereign's latest marital choice. Throughout the palace, scaffolding rose and fell like restless tides, as craftsmen laboured under torchlight to install fresh tapestries, paint new portrait, and inscribe chapels with the names of consorts who might yet be forgotten by next fortnight. Meanwhile, the royal treasury, once flush with revenues from wool trade and customs duties, dwindled under the strain of endless celebrations and their sombre counterparts. Lavish weddings boasted feasts so grand that entire herds of cattle and flocks of geese were consumed in a single day. The costs of annulments, reburials, and funeral processions for discarded queens mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. There were stipends and pensions to be paid to the mistresses who had served their purpose. Their fortunes quickly reversed when they were cast aside. Their children, if acknowledged, required endowments sufficient to uphold princely dignity. Each of these expenses bled the crown's coffers, leaving the exchequer's ledgers stained with ink as dark as the night. In the name of sponsoring royal nuptials, Henry enacted the dissolution of the monasteries, a systematic closing of abbeys, priories, and convents across England and Wales. The lands and treasures once held by centuries of Benedictine and Cistercian monks were confiscated, piled into royal stores, and sold off to favoured courtiers. Ancient illuminated manuscripts, relics carved from ivory, and ornate altarpieces disappeared into private collections or were melted down for bullion. The demolition of cloisters and chapter houses evoked a frenzied panic among reformers and onlookers alike, as once sacred spaces were repurposed into stables, barracks, or even public markets. Art historians would later lament the irreparable losses to religious art and medieval architecture. But in the fevered frenzy of Tudor ambition, every chalice and every rood screen was seen as a means to replenish a treasury drained by the king's matrimonial obsessions. Academia, too, was not immune to these upheavals. University halls in Oxford and Cambridge, once devoted to discourse on scripture and scholastic philosophy, reoriented toward the pressing needs of the throne. Theology lectures pivoted from monastic teachings to royal apologia, with scholars drafting treatises justifying the king's divorces and remarriages as necessary for the realm's stability. Faculties of law expanded into the drafting of bespoke statutes, texts that articulated the precise conditions under which a marriage might be annulled or a child legitimized. The study of civil and canon law merged into a unified curriculum aimed at producing adept legal minds capable of scripting the king's next matrimonial decree. Scribes in ink-stained chambers pored over the Great Bible, annotating passages to conform with the latest royal interpretation, while dusty volumes of church fathers gathered Scotch tape and marginalia, proclaiming their newfound allegiance to crown over pope. Against this backdrop of institutional transformation, the status of women in English society plummeted to precarious depths. If a reigning queen clad in velvet and crown could not claim autonomy, how tenuous must the lot of a common woman be in villages and towns? Women spoke in hushed tones about the fear that any misstep might be construed as treasonous, neglect, or unwarranted insolence to the king's will. To question a magistrate's order, or to chide a bailiff for overdue tithes, could draw accusations of sedition. The most vulnerable were those who relied upon charity widows whose meagre dowries had been appropriated by the crown, and tenant farmers' wives whose crops were levied as royal tithes to honour the latest royal wedding or the abrupt annulment that followed. In the shadow of Westminster, women walked the streets with bent heads and tightened cloaks, ever mindful that the slightest rumour of impropriety could echo through court circles and return to them as an accusation of betrayal. Even the architects of the day, who once enjoyed patronage building chapels and teaching halls, now received commissions for private residences, tailored to serve as both sumptuous retreats and secretive havens for royal affairs. Manor houses sprouted hidden galleries and blind corridors, architectural devices that allowed discreet passages between chambers. Wealthy gentry, eager to share in the spoils of monastic lands, adopted these novel designs, creating labyrinthine estates that mirrored the convoluted alliances of court. Estate inventories, once straightforward records of livestock and grain stores, transformed into ledgers of portrait collections, gasketed caskets of devotional texts, and locked cabinets for papal bulls, relics now prized as symbols of contested faith. In the hush of evening, as torches guttered against ancient stone, one might hear the distant hammer of a mason chiselling out a queen's coat of arms, to be replaced by another at the king's next whim. Beyond the palace walls, townsfolk laboured to afford new taxes, imposed to fund the latest ecclesiastical reforms. Farmers rolled their shoulders beneath the weight of corn sacks meant to feed the queen's retinue, while weavers produced bolts of silk for garments that would clothe a bride who might soon be unmade by royal decree. The very fabric of everyday life, threads of silk, bricks of stone. The sheets of parchment bore silent witness to the rule of a man whose desires reshaped an entire nation's landscape. And so, within the stone cloisters and timber-framed houses of Tudor England, the echoes of laughter and lamentation mingled. Each refurbished room and imprinted seal told a story of shifting power, too of wealth, diverted from piety to pageantry, and of women and men swept into a vortex, not of their making. As candlelight waned in abbey, ruins and market stalls emptied of coin, the kingdom found itself forever altered by the restless tides of Henry's matrimonial pursuits, a realm where architecture, economics, and faith had all been harnessed to the rhythm of a sovereign's unceasing appetite. The legacy of Henry VIII stretched across centuries. Its echoes felt long after the House of Lancaster gave way to the dawn of the House of Stuart. In those early Stuart years, a new constraint settled upon the monarchy. Royal marriages now required the assent of Parliament, a clear signal that the king's absolute power had been tempered, however slightly, by the voice of the people. No longer could a sovereign simply command a wedding or annulment by royal fiat. The statutes enacted under Henry's reign had established precedents that demanded broader approval and legal oversight. Simultaneously, the Church of England, born from Henry's break with Rome, embarked on a slow journey of self-reform. It distanced itself further from its Roman roots, yet strove to fortify its own structures against the mistakes of its founder. Bishops and archbishops drafted ecclesiastical canons intended to shield the church from becoming the personal plaything of any future monarch. Cathedrals retained the Book of Common Prayer, revised and clarified to emphasize communal worship over royal ceremony. Clergy were reminded in sermons and synods that their true allegiance lay with parishioners rather than palace intrigue. Yet the scars left by Henry's brutal marriage policies remained etched deep into the national psyche. Noble children were taught from early days that they might one day be cast into the royal sphere, presented as tokens in a dynastic game that knew no mercy. Parents in gentry households lived in quiet terror that a single summons and envoy's letter bearing the king's seal could whisk their daughters away into a world of intrigue and peril. Townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about aristocratic mothers who kept their daughters indoors after dusk, fearing that an errant glance could seal a young woman's fate. Society at large came to regard legal violence, those swift trials for treason or adultery, as a perfectly acceptable solution to personal grievances, a dark inheritance from a king who equated his bedchamber to a court of law. In the hush of stately drawing rooms and echoing courtrooms alike, whispers circulated among modern historians that Henry himself may have suffered lingering effects from a jousting accident, a violent blow to the head that splintered more than bone, perhaps fracturing his mind. Some scholars argued that his erratic moods, his ease with ordering executions and then feasting in the great hall, hinted at a fragmented psyche, divided between a man of state terror and a man of carnal excess. Faint traces of these theories appeared in personal letters and medical treatises of the time, though none dared pronounce such diagnoses openly for fear of invoking royal wrath. Thus emerged the stark image of a king who had turned his bedroom into a tribunal, and marriage into a death sentence. Under his rule, vows exchanged in innocence were later dissected in councils, each syllable weighed against the shifting demands of politics and passion. A union first blessed by archbishop and priest might, within months, to be pronounced null and void when the king's desires shifted, Dozens of women, from queens to chambermaids, passed through the curtain of Henry's bedchamber, each one a chapter in a history where love, faith, and law were inexorably entwined with power. As the Stuart kings grappled with their own marital alliances, they could not escape the shadow of Henry's example. Charles I, for all his philosophical leanings, shivered at the memory of swift annulments and scaffolded queens, mindful that to marry without clear parliamentary consent risked rekindling Ireland's and Scotland's rebellions. Even Charles's ill-fated match with a French princess was negotiated with caution born of Tudor trauma, every clause vetted in the Commons to avoid repeating those secretive, unilateral moves that had once rent Christendom. Over time, the narrative of Henry's reign came to serve as a warning across all levels of society. In law schools, students studied the Tudor statutes as lessons in how legal frameworks could be manipulated by those in authority. In parish churches, sermons contrasted the virtues of stable, loving marriage with the chapter of royal excess that had cast thousands into ruin. In the countryside, the folk songs sprang up lamenting the king, who wed and shed a refrain passed down by travelling minstrels, murmured around hearth fires at dusk. Even Britain's imperial ambitions carried the imprint of this legacy. As English ships ventured to distant shores, they carried with them not only trade goods but also legal codes that bore the marks of Tudor origin. Colonial settlements drafted marriage ordinances and treason clauses, modelled on those first set forth by Henry VIII, unaware that they were echoing the personal dramas of a 16th century monarch's bedroom. Across the oceans, judges would cite these statutes, never realizing that they had become global instruments of power, conceived at a time when sex and sovereignty had become inseparable. Century later, tourists, strolling the corridors of Hampton Court Palace or the darkened halls of the Tower of London, still sensed a lingering unease. Between the ornate wood carvings and the cobbled courtyards, one could almost hear the soft murmur of prayers, once whispered in chapels, long since dismantled. The double-headed eagles and Tudor roses that adorned doorways now seemed less like decorative motifs and more like silent witnesses to an age when love and law were wielded with equal ruthlessness. And in the quiet moments before sleep, claimed the day, the readers of history might close their dusty tomes and ponder the lessons of that reign. How easily institutions could bend to satisfy a single voracious will. How even holy vows might be unravelled by royal command. And how the interplay of power, sexuality, and religion could reshape a nation's destiny. For when a king had bent the course of English law to his bedroom ambitions, the aftershocks would ripple outward, forging a legacy that time could neither ignore nor fully erase. Thus stands the story of Henry VIII, an ever-present caution that absolute power, when intertwined with unbridled desire, can transform the very foundations of politics, culture, and human trust, leaving a realm forever changed in its somnolent wake. Shortly after, Henry breathed his last in 1547. A gentle wind of restitution began to stir through the corridors he had wrought with terror. Catherine Parr, the resilient widow who had nursed him through his final infirmities, soon remarried and took up a quiet life as an honoured royal sister. Her presence, a calming echo of gentler days. In another corner of the realm, Anne of Cleves, once dismissed for her plainness, graciously accepted her title of princess by permission, living comfortably upon generous estates that allowed her to host lavish gardens and serene banquets far from the sharper edges of court intrigue. Meanwhile, century later, modern scholarship would unravel the tangled webs of accusations spun around Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Historians pored over surviving trial transcripts and discovered glaring absurdities, allegations so outrageous ranging from adulteries with multiple gentlemen to incestuous whispers that they could only have been concocted to degrade these prostate queens. In the public mind, the proceedings, it turned out, were less about justice and more about spectacle. Theatrical performances designed to persuade a wary populace that these women were monsters deserving of death. Henry, it seemed, had wielded sexuality as a blade of political power, branding any union found inconvenient as treasonous betrayal before seeking fresh victims in his unending quest for gratification. In the hushed libraries of Oxford and Cambridge, scholars now characterize Henry as a cruel narcissist, possessed by a fractured psyche that could order an execution at dawn and then feast lavishly by candlelit banquet at dusk. Medical historians debate whether a jousting accident in 1536, a blow to the head that fractured more than just bone, may have cracked the king's mind into shards of rage and revelry. Yet the true horror lies not in his rumoured madness, but in the methodical ease with which he transformed intimacy into a weapon, capable of uprooting dynasties and shattering lives. This grim legacy seeped into the arts and letters of successive eras, ballads of lament spread across the countryside, their mournful melodies drifting through village lanes, songs that told of Anne Boleyn's pale tears and Catherine Howard's final prayers as she knelt at the block. In candlelit taverns, patrons crooned verses about royal treachery, their voices low and quivering, as though recalling nightmares half-remembered. Later, novelists of the Romantic and Victorian periods would seize upon these tales, crafting narratives that sought to restore dignity to the wronged queens. In richly painted pages, they reimagined Anne as a victim of courtly misogyny and Catherine as a tragic ingenue destroyed by forces beyond her control. These works, though cloaked in fictional flourish, echoed a single warning that women, once ensnared in Henry's designs, had been reduced to mere objects of political calculus. Painters, too, absorbed these cautionary themes. Gallery walls exhibited striking portraits of fallen consorts. Anne, her eyes downcast in sorrow, draped in black velvet. Catherine, cheeks pale, clutching a sprig of rosemary for remembrance. The chiaroscuro of candlelit chambers became a favourite motif, emphasising the flickering duality of love and violence that had defined Tudor romance. Art critics noted how these images conveyed a silent protest against the era's merciless power plays, each brushstroke mourning the obliteration of genuine affection beneath the weight of royal whim. Through ballad and brush, literature and lament, Henry's manipulations of marriage and morality were indictments writ large upon the cultural canvas. Visitors to stately homes read pamphlets hidden in satin-lined drawers, discovering poems that rebuked the king's bedchamber as a chamber of horrors. Academics in dimly lit seminar rooms debated the ethics of rewriting history, striving to amplify the voices of those whose names had been silenced by scaffold and decree. Yet even as poets and painters laboured to honour the memory of Tudor women, the kingdom found itself waking to the lessons of those dark days. Legal reforms gradually enshrined protections against arbitrary marital annulment. Ecclesiastical courts regained a measure of independence from royal command. Parliaments passed statutes affirming that no ruler could dissolve a marriage without substantial cause and broad consent, a direct repudiation of Henry's unilateral power in a subdued triumph. The principle that vows should be sacred rather than subject to the ruler's appetites was woven back into the tapestry of English law. And so, in sleepy cathedrals, where the hush of prayer mingled with the distant toll of ancient bells, one might still feel the weight of Tudor tragedies. Beneath vaulted ceilings, clergy recited marriage bans not only as ritual, but as a reaffirmation that love need not bow to capricious authority. In nearby villages, women greeted marriage with cautious joy, mindful of the centuries-old cautionary tales, yet hopeful that their own unions would be shielded by more stable foundations. Thus concluded the long shadow of Henry VIII's reign, a slow, lingering dusk that finally gave way to a gentler dawn. The Restoration and the Enlightenment carried forward the hard-won wisdom that power, unchecked by compassion, could warp the most sacred bonds. Even as history moved on, the ballads and paintings remained, faint and fading though they might be, reminders that when a king transforms his royal bed into a courthouse, the echoes of that transgression can reverberate across generations in the quiet moments before sleep. As candlelight flickers and pages rustle, we might hear again the soft lament of a Tudor ballad, reminding us that beneath the trappings of glory and grandeur, there lies a warning, a slow, soft echo of voices silenced far too soon, urging us to remember that love, once turned into a weapon, demands eternal vigilance lest it be wielded again, as if his marital machinations were not enough. Henry's unquenchable lust gave birth to a merciless sexual market within Tudor England's upper echelons. Noble families poured fortunes into cultivating alliances at court, training their daughters from earliest childhood in the arts of flattery, posture, and modest allure. Etiquette lessons included subtle eyebrow raises to catch a king's glance, whispered secrets meant to tantalize rather than offend, and the careful selection of silks that would both display wealth and invite royal attention. Parents prayed by candlelight that their daughters might be chosen, hoping for the unwritten reward of titles and lands in exchange for fleeting royal favour. Yet, in the same breath, those mothers beseeched the heavens for protection, begging that their child not stumble into Henry's insatiable gaze, from which escape seemed impossible. Through Henry's reign, a new measure of English masculinity took form. A man's worth was gauged not by chivalric deeds or scholarly pursuits, but by the tally of women claimed and the ruthlessness exhibited toward those deemed unworthy. This brutal standard seeped into the heart of courtly life, warping the code of gentlemanly conduct into a doctrine of dominance. Ladies-in-waiting learned to present themselves with calculated reserve, lest they appear too eager and risk losing their chance, or too indifferent and be dismissed as unpalatable. The dance of courtship became less a graceful waltz of mutual admiration and more a deadly game of predators and prey. Royal betrothals, once heralded as instruments of peace and alliance, transformed into high-stakes gambits that foreign princesses approached with trepidation. The French Dauphine faced hours under the scrutinizing stars of Henry's court, her portrait dissected for evidence of symmetry and youth. A Danish princess, upon arrival, found her wardrobe criticized in public councils, her features spoken of in hushed tones as either fitting or failing the king's mercurial tastes. When Henry deemed a bride insufficient, too plain, too tall, or too reserved, annulments were declared almost as soon as the bridal train had passed the palace gates. Each failed match sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, toppling long-planned treaties and prompting new calculations of power. In that climate, foreign courts learned that to negotiate with England meant courting risk. A princess might gain a throne one day and lose her title the next, all at the whim of a sovereign whose affections were as fleeting as they were perilous. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere resembled that of a spy's lair. Royal guards patrolled with eager ears, listening for whispers in hallway alcoves, chambermaids and footmen, seeking royal favour or fearing reprisal, were trained to report every hushed conversation or stolen glance. Foreign dignitaries discovered that their every gesture, an averted gaze or a lingering handshake, could be misinterpreted as treasonous or lecherous. Guests from overseas were shown curtsies by day and escorted to private interrogations by night, where they were questioned about rumours of courtly intrigue. Even the king's most trusted friends found their confidences betrayed, for the network of informants extended from the wax-filled corridors to the rose gardens where clandestine meetings once offered respite. In this world, turned inside out, intimacy was no longer a sanctuary but a matter of state security. A love letter sealed with a royal crest could be both a passport to privilege and evidence of conspiracy. Women who sought refuge in prayer retreats or convents found their sanctuaries violated by spies disguised as pilgrims. Every whispered confession risked becoming a charge of conspiracy against the crown. The palace chapel, once a place of solemn devotion, echoed at times with the hush of intercepted messages and the rustle of hidden dispatches. Clergy were sworn to silence under threat of severed benefices or worse, branded as heretics and burned before the very altars where they once preached. Thus, Henry's court became an arena where personal desire and political strategy were inseparable. A flicker of candlelight on the velvet gown of a waiting lady might signal a meeting arranged by spies. a clandestine rendezvous recorded in a ledger as if it were an entry in the treasury. Courtiers learned to sleep with one eye open. For the betrayal that struck in the bedchamber could echo in the council chamber at dawn. Beyond the palace gates, the common folk whispered of this invisible network, trading fearful stories of acquaintances who vanished overnight. Tavern owners warned travellers not to share tales of English intrigues, lest they too be taken for questioning. Merchants, mindful of the king's interest in the nobility's intimate affairs, counted each royal decree as a potential threat to their livelihoods, a reminder that even distant villages lay within reach of the court's long and watchful arm. And so the Tudor court, where once music and laughter filled the halls, came to resemble a vast machine of surveillance and suspense. Every sumptuous feast, every masked ball, every hunting party carried with it the underlying knowledge that one's words or actions might be recorded, reported, and repurposed in the deadly politics of Henry's desires. In the quiet moments, before the torches guttered out, courtiers drifted through shadowed corridors with hearts pounding softly, as if they heard the faintest echo of a command that could alter their fates forever. In that somnolent hush, one might almost sense the kingdom itself, holding its breath, waiting for the next royal summons, the next whispered rumour, the next shift in power that would redraw the lines between love, loyalty, and law. For under Henry's rule, every act of intimacy became both a transaction and a trap, marking an era in which the human heart was no more safe than the crown it sought to serve. The line between public duty and private desire blurred when the king's exploits in the bedchamber became matters of theology and jurisprudence. The Church of England, born from Henry's break with Rome, bent scripture and canon law to its monarch's wishes, recasting royal marriages as rituals that could be revised at will. Bishops delivered sermons explaining how the same passages of the Bible that condemned divorce now justified it when the king's heir was at stake. Marital vows, once considered inviolable, were proclaimed subject to royal discretion, and the Book of Common Prayer was annotated with margin notes, declaring that divine blessing flowed only as long as the sovereign's pleasure was served. In response, English universities shifted their priorities almost overnight. Lecture halls that had once echoed with medieval Latin hymns now filled with debates on the limits of royal prerogative. Theology professors who once guided aspiring priests through the doctrines of sacrament and salvation found themselves drafting treatises in defense of annulment. Law schools founded new chairs in regal matrimonial statutes, teaching students how to craft bespoke acts of parliament that declared a marriage valid 1 year and null the next. Pupils pored over annotated biblical texts, learning to spot every verse that could be contorted into support for a royal divorce or remarriage. By candlelight, they annotated margins with references to the king's latest edict, ensuring that no passage remained immune to reinterpretation. Young noblemen and noble women grew up under the shadow of these shifting doctrines. From their earliest lessons in courtesy and Latin, they understood that a single summons to court might elevate them to princely status or abandon them to obscurity. Girls were warned that their purity, once a cherished virtue, was now at risk of being measured less by innocence than by their ability to navigate courtly intrigue. Rather than learning only harp and needlework, they were taught subtle arts of self-preservation, how to catch the king's eye without igniting jealousy, how to speak soft truths that flattered without offending, and how to mask disappointment beneath a practiced smile. For many, the promise of wealth and title came hand in hand with the fear of being discarded the moment the sovereign's tastes shifted. Parental homes, once bastions of familial warmth, became cold theatres of calculation. Fathers haunted their halls, debating whether to present their eldest daughter at court or keep her safely hidden in the country manor. Mothers whispered prayers in lonely chambers, beseeching saints to keep their children from becoming part of the king's unholy ledger of lovers. Estates once governed by clear primogeniture now bristled with tension as siblings plotted alliances or lamented lost opportunities. Every family gathering held undercurrents of worry. Each toast, whispered with a note of apprehension, Could this marriage contract end in a title, or in a forced departure under royal command? In villages beyond the estate walls, common folk caught wind of these changes in scraps of gossip. They spoke of squires' daughters, whisked to town for royal audiences, and returned weeks later without word of where they had been or what had befallen them. They heard tales of bailiffs and priests summoned to attest to annulments, turning once simple wedding ceremonies into complex legal dramas. The notion of home, rooted in the security of family bonds, began to feel as fragile as a rippling reflection in a pond disturbed by courtly currents. Even in the idle hours of Berkshire lanes and Somerset fields, people sensed a shift in the social contract. Marriage, a lifelong promise of mutual support, now wore the mark of impermanence. Parish registers recorded unions struck down by royal writ. Records of children's baptisms held marginal notes, citing changes in their parents' status. Beneath the steady tick of the church clock, a hush settled over Sunday congregations, as villagers watched priests tread carefully around the topic of matrimony, lest they be accused of impiety or treason. Meanwhile, in the capital's grand halls, the echo of quills scratching across parchment never truly ceased. Courtiers consulted legal codices for the latest amendments. Petitions arrived by the sackful, seeking confirmation that a marriage was legitimate or, conversely, that it never had been valid. Chandeliers flickered as law clerks laboured deep into the night, ensuring each statute bore the necessary clauses to satisfy both divine sanction and royal appetite. Every newly minted Act of Parliament reaffirmed the unsettling truth that personal devotion had become legislative business, and so the Tudor household, from its lofty battlements to its hidden servants' staircases, bore witness to an era in which the sacred intimacy of marriage was subsumed by the apparatus of state. Vows that might once have bound two people in love now bound an entire nation to the shifting whims of one man's bedchamber. In the weary hours before dawn, when the castle lay silent and only the whisper of wind stirred the tapestries, one could almost hear the faded echoes of wedding vows swallowed by the machinery of royal decree. In that dim silence, the kingdom's foundations trembled, the sacred promise of family splintered under the weight of political expediency, and the private hearts of women and men became conduits for power plays that reverberated across chapel and court alike. The Tudor age, for all its grandeur and pageantry, would be remembered as a time when the boundary between public authority and private desire dissolved into a restless dream, and family itself became the Queen's most perilous stage. Henry VIII's unprecedented assertion of personal desire as law set a stark precedent for absolutism. When the sovereign himself could sanctify a private liaison, the machinery of state bent to his will without question. Generations later, this unchecked royal prerogative would contribute to the fires of the English Civil War in the 17th century. Parliament, having witnessed the turmoil wrought by Henry's unilateral annulments and remarriages, insisted that future royal marriages require its approval, an explicit check on monarchical power. This stipulation became a cornerstone of Stuart-era conflicts. As kings and commons struggled over the proper boundaries of royal authority, in the century that followed, noble families adopted new strategies to protect their bloodlines. Daughters once educated at court, learning the arts of grace and diplomacy, were now kept in the countryside, far from London's dangerous intrigues. Country manors became refuges. Girls practiced needlework and reading under the watchful eye of governesses, but they seldom travelled to the capital until they were safely wed. The traditional model of upbringing, where young aristocrats were sent to serve as pages and ladies-in-waiting, was upended. Schools in Oxford and Cambridge, previously geared toward producing court scholars, refocused on pastoral training and local gentry education, ensuring that the next generation might avoid the fate of those who had been swept into Henry's webs. Modern psychiatry has cast a retrospective eye upon Henry's later years, suggesting that a serious head injury from a jousting accident in 1536 may have precipitated a form of dissociative personality disorder. Witness accounts hint at a terrifying duality one facet of the king ordering executions at dawn, the other feasting and serenading courtiers by candlelight that very evening. His chronic leg wound and expanding girth from obesity and possible diabetes left him increasingly dependent on mesmeric fits of cruelty to affirm his potency. In private letters, physicians noted his unpredictable mood swings, one moment reflective and devout, the next raging at perceived slights. This cruel detachment spawning arbitrary violence against those once favoured, etched into the national consciousness, enduring images of a lecherous tyrant and queens dispatched like worn-out gowns. Across the country, these archetypes took root in folklore and ballad. Rustic singers crooned of the lustful lord in velvet cloak, whose passion spawned both opulent pageants and bloody scaffoldings. Elders in village alehouses warned wide-eyed youths of royal roses plucked only to wither quickly under the king's foot. Among gentry families, cautionary tales circulated of princesses whose dowries vanished overnight when a court marriage was annulled, or of gentlewomen who disappeared without trace, rumoured to have perished by royal decree. These stories, half-whispered, half-sung, wove a tapestry of fear that enveloped England's social fabric. In the halls of power, lawyers and philosophers grappled with the legacy of Tudor absolutism. Sir Edward Coke, in his celebrated commentaries on the laws of England, decried the notion that the Crown could suspend statutes at whim, citing Henry's marital innovations as stark examples of legal caprice. Coke's arguments would later underpin parliamentary attempts to restrain the Stuarts, drawing a direct line between Tudor excesses and the assertion of common law rights against royal overreach. The debates that fueled civil strife in the mid-17th century over ship money, forced loans, and the king's ability to levy taxes echoed Henry's habit of reshaping law to suit his bedchamber desires. Women, too, bore the brunt of these shifting tides. Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, learned well the lesson of her father's capricious passions. Her deliberate choice to remain unmarried, casting herself as the Virgin Queen, was as much a political strategy as a personal vow, shielding her realm from the turmoil of dynastic marriage. In doing so, she inverted the Tudor pattern rather than using marriage to consolidate power. She used perpetual widowhood to preserve stability. Yet even her cautious reign could not wholly eradicate the memory of discarded queens. Noble families continued to guard their daughters' prospects zealously, sometimes withholding them entirely from marriageable age, lest they become pawns once more in a game ruled by male caprice. By the 19th century, the phrase divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, had become a schoolyard rhyme, a chilling mnemonic that encapsulated the Tudor marital roller coaster. Tour guides at Hampton Court and the Tower of London recited it with morbid relish, reminding visitors that power and passion, when fused in one man, could devastate not only individual lives, but entire generations. Architects of the Gothic revival often incorporated Tudor motifs, pointed arches, crenellated battlements, and heraldic shields as ornamental warnings of a bygone era when crowns trumped conscience. In literature and drama, playwrights invoked Henry's reign as an epitome of autocratic folly. Restoration dramatists depicted him as a cautionary figure whose unchecked desires led to tyranny. Romantic poets lamented the squandered potential of those who had fallen victim to his whims. Even in the early days of the Victorian novel, reform-minded authors used Tudor stories to critique contemporary gender and legal inequalities, drawing parallels between past and present injustices. These cultural works ensured that the memory of Henry's violent courtship politics remained alive, reverberating through centuries as a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute rule. Thus, the portrait of Henry VIII as a lecherous despot and of the queens who perished became ingrained in England's collective memory. Noble lineages preserved portrait collections labelled, "Beware the King's Favour," while rural communities passed down cautionary lullabies about the perilous allure of royal glamour. And in the softly lit corridors of modern museums, visitors still pause, before the glass cases containing Tudor artifacts, a queen's jewelled girdle, the battered trial transcripts of a condemned consort, and the faded vellum of royal warrants. In these silent relics, one can almost feel the ghostly murmur of an age when love and law collided in deadly embrace. In the end, Henry's legacy endured as a sombre testament that when a king wields his sexual power as legal force, the ripples of his desires can unsettle not only the throne but the very foundations of society, resonating through history as warnings murmured in the hush before sleep, urging vigilance lest the bedchamber once more become the crucible of tyranny. The physical remnants of Henry VIII's reign still dot the English landscape like scars upon the land. In grand castles and manor houses, one can still find hastily patched walls where stonemasons erased the heraldic devices of a discarded queen, only to carve new insignia for her successor before dawn's light. In the vaulted corridors of Hampton Court, you may notice dabs of mortar, where an old relief of Anne Boleyn once stood, now replaced by a sculpted shield bearing the emblem of Jane Seymour or Catherine Parr. Even the towers of the Tower of London bear faint marks, chisel scratches, and uneven mortar testifying to the rapid turnover of royal portraiture and the relentless quest to keep every symbol aligned with the king's latest marital whim. Monastic treasuries, once bursting with gleaming chalices and jewel-encrusted reliquaries, were ransacked in the name of funding royal nuptials. Cloister kitchens, which had quietly fed generations of monks and pilgrims, became storehouses for masons' tools and scaffolding. In the emptied nave of Chertsey Abbey, for example, you can still see the grease stains from carpentry, a grim reminder that holy spaces were sacrificed to bankroll feasts, fit for a king who celebrated wedding after wedding. Walk among the rubble of those dissolved monasteries, and you, a visitor centuries later, feel the echo of silver coins clinking into royal coffers, each one paying for yet another crown, another annulment, another funeral. Under Henry's laws, sexual intimacy with the sovereign became enshrined as both privilege and peril. Adultery with the king, once merely scandalous, was transformed into an act of treason. In the dim cells beneath Whitehall, historical accounts record that some unfortunate women were subjected to torture, interrogated until they confessed to imagined dalliances. Their screams, muffled by damp stone walls, served as a gruesome warning that justice had blurred into blind obedience once the king called time on his bedchamber games. In the hush of the night, the cuff of a jailer's glove or the whisper of chains was enough to send chills through the heart of any woman who might be summoned to that private tribunal. Hundreds of nameless women found themselves marked by Henry's favour, richly endowed one day, forgotten the next. A chambermaid might awaken to find herself draped in fine brocade, offered a quiet pension, and then escorted from the palace gates with a curt bow. Others, less fortunate, never left at all, their bodies interred in unmarked graves within castle grounds, tales of their fate buried alongside them. Even now, the thickets around Eltham Palace whisper of girls who vanished into storerooms and were never seen again, their footsteps fading into folklore as shadows among the trees. When the Stuarts ascended, they retained the crucial reform that all royal marriages must secure Parliament's blessing. In this way, they acknowledged the urgent necessity of limiting the Crown's unilateral power. The Church of England, too, gradually disentangled itself from direct royal manipulation, striving to protect its clerics from sudden edicts that might compel them to break their vows or bend scripture. Yet the social wounds inflicted by decades of arbitrary marriages and executions refused to heal neatly. Today, tourists who wander through Hampton Court and the Tower of London sense a chill that no modern heating system can dispel. In the Guards' Chapel at Hampton Court, they pause before a plaque commemorating Catherine Howard, aged 15, when she walked to the scaffold, and feel the hush of old sorrows. In the Bloody Tower of the Tower of London, they imagine Anne Boleyn's footsteps echoing against damp stone, the clatter of her chains fading like a lament. Guides tell of phantom wails heard by candlelight, the soft rustle of silk where no living hand stirs. Even in bright midday sun, Those ancient walls exude the weight of countless tragedies, their very stones imbued with the memory of royal lust turned lethal. Henry's mad sexual ambitions stand as an ageless, cautionary tale. Unchecked power, when fused with ungoverned desire, can transform an entire nation into its victim. His legacy towers ruined, laws twisted into instruments of terror, and lives extinguished for the sake of his caprice, lingers still, stubborn and unyielding. It reminds us that the line between privilege and punishment, between love's promise and love's betrayal, can be drawn by the will of a single individual. So when you walk beneath the Tudor arches and trace your fingers over the weathered coats of arms, remember that these structures are more than relics of stone and timber. They are monuments to the perils of passion, unbraked by conscience, and the perilous marriage of sex and sovereignty. In that gentle sigh of a breeze through deserted courtyards, in the echo of distant bells tolling for long-dead queens, you may hear the echo of history's warning that when a ruler treats intimacy as law, the soul of a people trembles, and the echoes of that tremble endure long after the king's voice has fallen silent. Finally, the tragic story of Henry VIII's raging lust and absolute power delivers several profound messages. First, it reminds us of the fragility of social institutions. When marriage, once regarded as the sacred symbol of love and responsibility, is transformed into a political tool, human values, and the bonds of mother and child, father and child, can be easily destroyed. From this, viewers understand that no system, however sturdy, can endure if power is left unchecked and unbalanced. Second, it teaches a lesson about the abuse of personal authority. Henry VIII wielded the power of the state to satisfy his own desires, proving that when any individual holds too much authority without community oversight, laws and moral principles alike can be distorted. Today, this story still serves as a warning about leaders or organizations that might turn the common good into instruments for personal ambition. Third, it illustrates the long-term consequences of moral corruption. The legal precedents set by Henry, from requiring Parliament's consent for royal marriages to expanding the definition of treason, left a legacy of conflict and division in England for centuries. We learn that every significant decision must be weighed carefully, for its effects can reach beyond personal lives and shape the fate of an entire nation. Fourth, on a human level, the tragedies endured by queens, princesses, and countless anonymous women reveal the enduring strength of the human spirit despite suffering. These women became symbols of courage and dignity, prompting us to reflect on how society treats its most vulnerable members. Finally, through this video, we learn the importance of balancing power with responsibility, of pairing justice with compassion. The history of Henry VIII is a reminder that every institution, no matter how grand, requires limits to safeguard human dignity and worth. As we celebrate individual freedom, we must never forget that such freedom must be accompanied by responsibility and mutual respect, so that the tragedies of the past are never repeated.